Good evening. My name is Dr. Daragh Gannon, and I'm Research Fellow at the School of History, Anthropology, Philosophy and Politics at Queen's University Belfast. It's my great pleasure to be able to speak to you this evening and to deliver the lecture, The I.R.A. Campaign in Great Britain. And on that note, I'd like to extend my thanks to Cavan Library and Jonathan Smith in particular for the invitation to speak to you this evening, and again to acknowledge Cavan County Council's really important Decade of Centenaries 2020 programme, of which this lecture is a part. I should also acknowledge the very useful and very supportive programme by the Department of Culture, Heritage and the Gaeltacht under the Decade of Centenaries 2012 to 2023, again, of which this lecture forms part. Now, before I go any further, I guess we really begin with the idea that Ireland had an island-led revolution, the idea that ambushes in local towns and communities, especially in Munster, really defined the Irish War of Independence. But what this lecture tries to present essentially is that there was a wider United Kingdom experience of political violence after the First World War. And one of the key architects of that violence was Michael Collins. Many of us will understand Collins's relationship with London in terms of the Anglo-Irish Treaty, and the images of which I present in this first slide of Collins in the top hat and suit is very much of the negotiator in London at Downing Street. However, Collins, of course, had a life in London before the Anglo-Irish Treaty. And what I will do in this lecture is document Collins's beginnings in London, his relationship with various organizations in Great Britain, and the development of political violence after the 1916 Rising across the Irish Sea. So as I mentioned, the emergence of Michael Collins is really important to understanding the development of a campaign of political violence in Great Britain during the War of Independence itself. And Michael Collins, as I mentioned, essentially became a Republican in the organised sense from his earlier time in London. So Collins' experience of exile in Edwardian London was formative to his Fenian disposition. While he was born in Clonakilty, County Cork in 1890, he emigrated to London, as many young people did at that time, to work in the civil service, for example, in 1906. He began his employment in the Postal Office Savings Bank and as a stockbroker in the city thereafter. However, I would argue that Collins found an iconoclastic political home in the London I.R.B. Here he was entered into the Fenian underworld by Sam Maguire in 1909. And here's a picture of the elusive Sam Maguire. There are not too many of these images in the public domain. And of course, Sam Maguire is the same Sam Maguire whose name is evoked each September at Croke Park for the winners of the All-Ireland Football Senior Football Championships. And Sam Maguire has very often been portrayed as Collins' mentor in London. Certainly they shared the upbringing in Cork and love of Gaelic games. And while Collins was a member of, for example, Sinn Féin in London, the Gaelic League, and other organisations, it really was the GAA which he attracted his energy and with which he devoted himself. And it is here again that we see another very famous and celebrated figure in modern day Gaelic games, Liam McCarthy, recurring, because Liam McCarthy was one of the formative influences in the London GAA alongside Sam Maguire. So the Gaelic Athletic Association had been formed in London in 1896 as a county board, was presided over by Liam McCarthy and Sam Maguire, as I've mentioned. However, it should be pointed out that while we associate the GAA today almost as a professional organisation in terms of its commitment to the game, its codification of the rules, and its playing of the game right around the world, essentially in Edwardian London, the GAA was very much an amateurish organisation. Gaelic games were played without the rules that we acknowledge today. In fact, several of the reports detail the idea that many of the players in London used associational football and rugby skills while playing the game. It was also important to note that they didn't often play in established GAA fields, but rather used the opportunity to play in open public spaces such as Clapham Common. And it wasn't further uncommon to find that the teams within the London GAA scene played using rugby posts, which were more available than obviously Gaelic football posts and goals. So this was the scene of which Collins was a part, and so he was very much known to Sam Maguire, and Liam McCarthy would also have been aware of Collins during this period. Collins was a member of the Geraldine Club, of which he was a secretary. But essentially, Collins was playing the field in two respects. He was playing for the Geraldines, especially as a hurler, as a player on the field, but also he was a member of the I.R.B, especially under the tutelage of Sam Maguire. And this was Collins's true Republican devotion, the Irish Republican Brotherhood. And Collins was one of the formative influences thereafter in 1913 through the Irish Republican Brotherhood, which established the Irish Volunteers in London in December of 1913, 1 month after the Irish Volunteers were established in Dublin. It would not be until April of 1914, however, that the London Irish Volunteers were publicly announced looking for members. So Collins, at this very early stage, was seen as the rising star in terms of Gaelic games, but also in terms of Republican politics in London. However, we see the dramatic division and split in Collins's experience of the Republican movement in London at the outset of the First World War. And much like in Ireland, nationalist movements in Great Britain divided after John Redmond's declaration of support for the British Armed Forces. The majority of the volunteers in London and elsewhere in Liverpool, Manchester and Glasgow enrolled in the British Armed Forces in the autumn of 1914, to the point that there were approximately only 200 members of Collins's London Irish Volunteers by December of that year. And they were forced very often to train in secret in underground basements, for example, because of course they were persona non grata in wartime Britain. They were not only unwilling to join the British Armed Forces and therefore disloyal in the minds of many people, but they were also seen to be a minority within the nationalist movement, given that Redmond had also argued for joining the British Armed Forces. And this is the image, of course, you see here of Collins in his Irish volunteer uniform, which was one of the first images which you see of Collins during this period. Now, ultimately, approximately 87 members of the Irish Volunteers, but also Cumann na Man in London, Liverpool, Manchester and Glasgow would take part in the 1916 Rising in Dublin, of which Collins was one. And their emigration to Ireland in January of 1916 was partly to take part in some form of fighting, although many of them did not know that the Rising was taking place, but also because they believed that they would be conscripted under the Military Service Bill of January of 1916 to fight in the British Armed Forces. So when they left cities like London, they were essentially leaving or abandoning their obligation to fight in the First World War. But they were also giving up their lives, families, jobs, career prospects, with potentially no possibility of returning home. And like I said, Collins was one of those who departed for Dublin in January of 1916. From looking at the evidence, it seems that Collins was aware, or more aware, I should say, than most of what was taking place. He, as a member of the I.R.B, he was in contact with leading figures of the secret military council who were planning the Rising. He recorded later that he had a meeting with Tom Clark in 1915, in which Clark urged him to prepare for the Rising. It's also clear that he met with Sean McDiarmid in May of 1915 when the latter visited London, during which plans for a Rising took place. So Collins certainly was aware of plans for a rebellion during the war, although he was probably unaware of the date of which those were to take place. He, of course, served as aide-de-camp to Joseph Plunkett in the GPO during the Rising, and he would later record his memory of that experience in the GPO. He said, looking at it from the inside, it had the air of a Greek tragedy. Now, Collins would return to Dublin, not London, after the 1916 Rising, following a period of internment at Frongoch, which of course has become known as the University of Revolution. And he returned not only as a veteran of the Rising, but also as an I.R.B. man. And it was to this position within the I.R.B. that he held greatest regard. He became a member of the Supreme Council of the I.R.B. after many of its senior officers, of course, had been executed following the Rising. And it was in this respect where he began planning for a renewal of war between Ireland and Great Britain following the Rising. Based on his experiences and contacts during his time prior in London, Collins developed a series of connections and personal relationships with I.R.B. contacts in Liverpool, London, and Glasgow. And you can see some of the figures who he dealt with primarily in this slide. And through these contacts, these I.R.B. contacts, Collins essentially established over time a very specialized, proficient, and somewhat professional network of arms gun runners. These were figures, I.R.B. men predominantly, who essentially were tasked by Michael Collins with supplying his squad of assassins in Dublin with close-range firearms, and with supplying the I.R.A. in Ireland more broadly with rifles, arms, ammunition, and explosives for the campaign against the Crown forces, including the Royal Irish Constabulary. So Collins judged the I.R.B. connection as absolutely vital to the continuation of any war of independence, especially from 1919. It's important to recognize, of course, that Great Britain, comparatively speaking, was a more opportune market for the acquirement, or the acquisition rather, of arms. We have returning soldiers demobilized after the First World War who are secretly selling their weapons for profit. After the Russian Revolution, we have international revolutionaries, left-wing revolutionaries, communists, who were looking for opportunities to spread international revolution, and Ireland was primed for revolution during this period. We also have the rise of criminality, crime gangs, much like we see in the television program Peaky Blinders, of which, of course, there are Irish connections, which are again looking for opportunities on the black market to sell guns, weapons, arms, ammunition, and explosives. So in places like London, Liverpool, Manchester, and Glasgow, Collins's I.R.B. contacts have abundant material to export to Ireland. And you can see the extent of some of these opportunities essentially in the correspondence which I've presented here, which essentially is précis of some of the correspondence between Michael Collins and Joe Vyse, his contact in Glasgow. And what was actually very advantageous to the smuggling of arms in Glasgow in particular was that outlying industrial areas such as Motherwell were often deployed to support the I.R.A. in terms of acquiring mines, for example, from industrialists, but also Irish miners who were working in the coal fields and so on. So there are specialized areas like Glasgow where Collins can really develop very strong connections. However, it was essentially Liverpool which became the capital of Collins's I.R.B. gun running or gun smuggling network. And this was made possible by the very strong Irish presence already at the Liverpool docklands in terms of employment. one of the I.R.B. figures, Steve Lanigan, who we have mentioned before, was a customs official, for example. And so during the day, in his day job, he was able to smuggle not only arms, ammunition, and explosives, but also correspondence over to Dublin to Collins, which was immensely helpful in this very secret war. It should also be pointed out that the Liverpool docklands and Collins's contacts on the boats, for example, were used to transport personnel, not only to Britain, but across the Atlantic as well. Most famously, Eamon de Valera was smuggled incognito onto a ship bound for New York in 1919, and so began his 18-month tour of the United States without being discovered by the British authorities. So these contacts were really vital to the ongoing intelligence conflict between the Irish Republican movement and the British state. And to give you a sense of the consistency of the arms smuggling network, I've given you this quote from Paddy Daly, who was one of the I.R.B. men tasked with transporting arms, ammunition, and explosives from Liverpool to Dublin, but also the extent to which, by certainly the end of 1920, November 1920, Liverpool had become the hub for an entire network of arms smugglers who would transport arms, ammunition, and explosives from London, Manchester, and Glasgow to Liverpool. Indeed, it's estimated that by the truce of 1921, 289 handguns, 53 rifles, 141 rounds of ammunition, and over 1,000 pounds of explosives had been transported from these British centres to Ireland via Liverpool. So this becomes the capital of Collins's network. Now, of course, when undertaking such criminal, notwithstanding conspiratorial activity, especially under the noses of the British authorities, Collins and his contacts in Great Britain ran the risk of being arrested, or worse, of being compromised at a high political level. And that will become an ongoing game of cat and mouse throughout the War of Independence. And perhaps the most famous or infamous episode of this intelligence contest was that of John Jameson. And the case of Jameson evidences that, number one, Collins, while it was claimed that he was the man who won the war, was not infallible, was potentially open to exposure during the War of Independence through these intelligence contacts, despite his reputation. Secondly, that Great Britain posed a threat as well as an opportunity to the Republican movement. And thirdly, that again, the War of Independence was a wider United Kingdom conflict, which cannot be understood by simply examining local conditions in Ireland. So the case of Jameson was a part of this broader post-war story. John Burns was a returning soldier from the British Army in 1919, where he was co-opted into A2, a branch of military intelligence, which was being deployed to survey returning soldiers, disaffected soldiers, with the belief that there was a threat of the rise of Bolshevism in Great Britain after the war. And as part of his pretense, Jameson posed as an aspiring revolutionary with contacts to gun runners and arms dealers in London. And of course, Collins's contacts, primarily Art O'Brien, Sean McGrath, but also Sam Maguire in London, were looking for an arms dealer who could supply a regular amount of shorthand weapons in particular, especially as Collins was trying to eliminate the members of G Division in Dublin Castle. So things like revolvers were very much in demand for that intelligence war in Dublin. Burns provided a resume which looked legit and provided a sample or a cache of weapons to Collins's men in London, which they subsequently sent to Dublin. And this became a regular supply to Collins's delight. Such was Collins's trust in Jameson that he granted him an interview in Dublin, one of the only times where an intelligence agent had actually met Collins for the entirety of the War of Independence. And in Jameson's report, which are recorded in detail, he accounts for Collins's behaviour during their meeting in Dublin. He said, quote, Collins at once spoke to 8, which was Jameson's code number, of the recent meeting in London, and asked him whether he understood the situation in Ireland, stating that the military were trying to suppress them and that they were being closely watched. He warned 8, or Jameson, that he must on no account recognise any of them in the street or in public places, and that he should not be seen in any place which was known to be connected with the Sinn Féin movement. He might even go as far as to display antipathy to the cause in any public demonstration. So Collins was clearly trusting of Jameson enough to meet him and give him this advice. However, he began to be suspicious that Jameson might be an agent when raids began to take place of meetings of Sinn Féin, of which Collins was due to attend, and of which he had told Jameson during their meetings. He urged thereafter his contacts in London, primarily Sam Maguire, to check on the bona fides of Jameson. And to Collins's horror, Sam Maguire reported that Jameson's reported or purported employer did not exist, that the home address that he had given was not accurate, and that Jameson was essentially posing as a gun runner after the war was potentially an intelligence agent. And learning this, Collins invited Jameson to meet him in Dublin on one last occasion. However, on this occasion, Collins himself was not present when Jameson arrived. And in February of 1920, Collins's men, his members of the squad, instead took Jameson to a lonely lane and shot him in the back of the head. And this essentially marked one of the closest shaves that Collins experienced during the War of Independence. And again, it was through those very important and very consequential contacts in London. But we should also acknowledge the extent to which intelligence was an asset for the Republican movement, especially in London. Sean McGrath, who was one of Collins's gun runners in London, later recorded, quote, "We had men in Admiralty, Home Office, and in the police, both men and women. We had one man in the Policemen's Union, a junior minister, an assistant minister. There was a man in Admiralty, a porter, who brought us out stuff to be copied. The post office was well organised." The post office, of course, was the domain of Sam Maguire. Maguire, again, one of those aspiring civil servants who emigrated from Ireland, worked in Mount Pleasant, which was the central sorting office of the General Post Office in London during this time. And Collins wrote daily to Sam Maguire through front men, essentially, enclosing letters for Sam, nicknamed SAM. And it's really one of the success stories of the Republican intelligence apparatus that Sam Maguire, working in the heart of the British Empire for the British state during his day job, was never identified by British intelligence. Now, as the title suggests, Collins was not only a member of the I.R.A, but also he was a member of the I.R.A. And while volunteer units had essentially disbanded in Great Britain during the war on account of members' enrolment in the British Armed Forces, but also the minority groups' participation in the 1916 Rising, volunteer units again began to emerge after the First World War from 1919 onwards, wherein a new generation of volunteers began to organise as volunteers of the I.R.A. So from 1919, we see volunteer units emerging in London, Liverpool, Manchester, and Glasgow, just like prior to the 1916 Rising, but also in places like Newcastle, which had not seen extensive volunteer companies before the First World War. It's important to recognise at this juncture that while Michael Collins considered Britain his territory, to use the phrase offered by John Borgonovo, other senior members of I.R.A. GHQ became increasingly interested in using Great Britain as a launching pad for attacks on the British state, especially as the War of Independence intensified in the autumn of 1920. Under increasing pressure by the arrival of the Black and Tans and auxiliaries in the spring and summer of 1920 respectively, members of the I.R.A., especially Liam Lynch and Terence McSweeney, at a meeting of I.R.A. GHQ that summer, suggested to Richard Mulcahy, who was I.R.A. Chief of Staff, that it would be of value to extend operations to Great Britain. Rory O'Connor, pictured here, who is nominally I.R.A. Director of Engineering, was then tasked with going on an exploratory mission in Great Britain to ascertain the possibilities. So while Collins was aware of this, he did not authorize the report on I.R.A. possibilities in Great Britain. This was the task of Rory O'Connor. And when Rory O'Connor reported back to Dublin, his ambitions for operations in Great Britain were spectacular. He identified the Liverpool docklands as a serious site for an act of I.R.A. reprisals. He argued for the blowing up of the docks at several places, the overturning of boats, and the burning of warehouses along the docks perimeter. He also argued for the destruction of a power station in Manchester and the destruction of timber yards in London. Now, what makes these operations all the more remarkable is what we've since discovered in a diary entry of Ernie O'Malley, in which it was stated that these attacks were due to take place on the same date, in sync with the Bloody Sunday attacks in Dublin of the 21st of November 1920. At least this was the aim. So it was due to take place in sync as a demonstration of strength on the part of the I.R.A. against Great Britain, just as the British Crown forces were essentially putting pressure on the I.R.A. in Dublin in particular. And of course, Collins must have been aware of these plans, in spite of the fact that they threatened his IRB arms connection in Liverpool. So that was the extent to which this planned attack would derail Collins' own operations. However, to the dismay of Richard Mulcahy, the plans were in fact found in one of Richard Mulcahy's safe houses before the plans could be fully planned out and coordinated. And the plans were released to the British press by Sir Hammer Greenwood in the British government, causing outrage among the British public, but also increasing security concerns were undertaken in London in particular. For example, the gallery in the House of Commons was closed to visitors because of the perceived threat of the I.R.A. in the capital. Protective measures were placed outside 10 Downing Street, and senior ministers were given bodyguards for fear of I.R.A. assassinations in London. So the British state took the threat of the I.R.A. in Great Britain very seriously. However, it was perceived that the eventual attacks would not take place, having formally released these plans to the public. However, on the 27th of November 1920, 15 warehouses along the Liverpool docks were burnt in an extended attack by the members of the Liverpool I.R.A. This was an enormous assault on the Liverpool docks, causing upwards of £500,000 in 1920s money of damage. It was widely reported by the British media at the time, which you can see in the following slide, especially in terms of British Pathé, which documented, using the cinema newsreels, documented the extent of the damage by panning across the Liverpool docks, showing the extent of the destruction by the Liverpool I.R.A. And again, this would have again resonated with ordinary Britons during this period, and essentially demonstrated the strength of the I.R.A. At that time. And that's really the significant aspect of much of the violence which takes place in Great Britain. While this was not the same attack planned by I.R.A. GHQ, which would have brought the Liverpool docks to a standstill, it nonetheless had a propagandist impact in terms of the visuals, which we see here in this presentation, and the psychological impact on the ordinary British people to demonstrate the reach of the I.R.A. This was also felt by the British cabinet during this period. And it's important to recognize that there are other events during this time, this very close time period, which get a lot of attention by historians as marking the apogee of the I.R.A. during the War of Independence. Most notably, as I mentioned, the attacks of Bloody Sunday on the 21st of November of 1920, but also the attacks at Kilmichael, County Cork on the 28th of November 1920, which saw the largest losses suffered by the British Armed Forces during the entirety of the War of Independence. And while those two events get a lot of attention on the part of Irish historians, the attention of the British cabinet was very firmly fixed on the potential threat of the I.R.A. in Great Britain itself. So between the 21st of November 1920 and the 5th of December 1920, the British cabinet discussed the threat of the I.R.A. in Great Britain on 3 separate occasions, more than either Bloody Sunday or Kilmichael. Winston Churchill, for example, stated, quote, "I would pay up to £5,000 for a hanging case," unquote, of any member of the I.R.A. David Lloyd George referred to, quote, "the present menacing attitude of the Sinn Féiners," unquote, in reference to the I.R.A. in Great Britain. And so it's remarkable the extent to which the events of the 27th of November 1920 have not been remembered to the same extent as those in Dublin or Cork. So Liverpool was foremost on the minds of senior British policymakers in November 1920. However, for Collins, the attacks of November 1920 essentially threatened to derail his plan to smuggle arms, ammunition, and explosives to Ireland. And you can see this in these letters which he writes, these very hurried or urgent and panicked letters he writes to Liverpool straight after the 27th of November 1920 attacks. He writes unknowingly on the 4th of December, quote, it is of the utmost importance that I should get a reply to this so that we may know how things are and who exactly is responsible to us in Liverpool," unquote. 5 days later, "I still am not quite sure who the writer of the pencil communication dated Sunday last is. So far as is humanly possible, the enemy must not be allowed to break up our organization, no matter whom he takes," unquote. And of course, by our organization, Collins meant the I.R.B. There was certainly a sense of tension between the I.R.A. and I.R.B., even in Great Britain during this period. And after the November 1920 attacks, we see the increasing intervention on the part of I.R.A. GHQ in Great Britain without the unilateral decision and influence of Michael Collins. Cathal Brugha, who was Dáil Éireann Minister for Defence and who was, of course, Collins's great rival during this period, essentially appointed Liam Mellows to become I.R.A. Director of Purchases, so in direct conflict with Collins's I.R.B. prerogative. And we see here a statement from Seamus Reader, who was a Glasgow contact of Michael Collins's, that, quote, "Late in 1920, a circular was sent out from the Supreme Council of the I.R.B., of which Collins, of course, by now was president, asking the members to give their allegiance to the Supreme Council, to stand fast, and to follow the Supreme Council as changes were about to take place. Liam Mellows warned me that there was hedging going on." And this causes great distress for Collins, as you can see in this letter dated 15th of January 1921. Under increasing pressure, not only because of the threat of being captured in Dublin itself, but also because of the potential undermining of his position over the I.R.B. in Great Britain, he explodes in a letter to Sean McGrath, his contact in London, when questioned about whether McGrath should buy arms or not. There is no necessity to refer for guidance on such a thing as this. Buy. So Collins is essentially being undermined in Great Britain by the I.R.A. And essentially, after the November of 1920 attacks in Liverpool, we see the dislocation of his connected arms network, which had been so successful and so proficient up until this point. He mentioned, for example, that he very rarely heard from Glasgow after this juncture. Also, the I.R.B. in London were nervous about contacting the I.R.B. in Liverpool for fear that they would be arrested, primarily because Neil Kerr and Steve Lanigan, his contacts in Liverpool, had been picked up straight after the November 1920 attacks. So essentially, the November 1920 I.R.A. attacks disrupted Collins's I.R.B. war from Great Britain. And that's one of the questions really that we have to ask ourselves in this period of commemoration, and which historians have asked themselves for the last 100 years. Was the I.R.A. in a position to continue the War of Independence on the eve of the truce? And the extent to which the I.R.B. had collapsed in Great Britain gives some sense of Collins's position on that question on the eve of the truce. Collins, for example, remarked to one of his contacts in Manchester days before the truce. He said, "I wish to God all the stuff from Manchester was here," unquote. So there is a sense of desperation on the part of Collins that the I.R.B. are no longer able to supply the I.R.A. in the field on the eve of the truce. Beyond Collins's influence, organisation, direction, the I.R.A. in Great Britain, however, go from strength to strength in 1921 and carry out a number of attacks and raids during this period, which are again orchestrated by I.R.A. GHQ, of which Collins is but one member, but are essentially directed by the Chief of Staff for Jamal Mulcahy from Dublin and organised, or at least overseen by Rory O'Connor, who styled himself as OC Britain, I.R.A. OC in Britain, during this period. So one of the most significant attacks took place on the 14th of May 1921, when members of the London I.R.A. and Liverpool I.R.A. carried out 16 attacks on the homes of Black and Tans and auxiliaries in those cities. And this resulted in the destruction of private property in London and Liverpool, but also because these were the family homes of members of the auxiliaries and Black and Tans, elderly members and children who were left behind, and wives, sisters, and daughters were essentially the victims of these I.R.A. attacks, in which 3 people were killed and a number were injured. And you can see that in the newspaper reports of the day. And of course, this was labeled terrorism by the British press, but also by the British government. But what was significant in terms of the importance of the I.R.A. campaign was that the British cabinet believed that the attacks in London and Liverpool were part of a broader I.R.A. push against the British Crown forces during this period. Sir Hammer Greenwood, for example, wrote to the cabinet stating, quote, "There would appear to be no doubt that they were the outcome of a long, prearranged plan to exhibit to the world the I.R.A.'s still unbroken power of maintaining an armed resistance to the authority of British law. The outrages simultaneously carried out in England were obviously part of the one general design," unquote. And this is, again, this idea of the propaganda of the deed. Even though these were small-scale attacks by comparison to the events in Ireland, they had a psychological impact not only on the British public, but on British policymakers, which made the I.R.A. a wider threat, a United Kingdom-wide threat to the security of Great Britain. The final series of attacks took place in June of 1921, wherein over the period of 3 weeks, I.R.A. forces in London, Liverpool, Manchester, but also in Tyneside and elsewhere, attacked communications networks in those British cities, causing disruptions to railway lines, telegraph wires, and other communications. The widespread nature of those attacks, even though they were described as mere pinpricks by some reports, again demonstrated that the I.R.A. was a resistant force despite the previous arrests, was a widespread force, and again, these attacks were seen to have taken place in conjunction with a broader I.R.A. push in Ireland itself. The extent to which the influence of Dublin was assumed is found in an intelligence report from Basil Thompson to the British Cabinet, in which it was stated that Michael Collins had been reportedly seen in London going around dressed as a Roman Catholic priest. And so there is this belief that, again, Collins, was directing these attacks. And this is the extent to which the British Cabinet in particular took these events seriously. The extent to which the British police force, British intelligence, notwithstanding the British armed forces, were unable to protect ordinary British citizens was very evident, especially in London, because from June of 1921, in response to these attacks, the London Metropolitan Police set up a series of checkpoints around the perimeter of the Greater London area, whereby cars were stopped by members of the London Met on a nightly basis, and people's documents were checked. And these checks of ordinary citizens really brought home the extent to which the I.R.A. campaign in Great Britain had penetrated the capital of the United Kingdom, and also the extent to which the British security was unable to protect ordinary citizens from the threat of the I.R.A. And those restrictions were not lifted until after the truce of the 11th of July 1921. And it's really remarkable the extent to which the I.R.A., despite the fact that, without certain historians, the majority of the general public in Ireland would not be aware of this early I.R.A. campaign in Great Britain, that it was widely known in Great Britain itself, that it caused considerable psychological concern among the British public, and perhaps most importantly of all, that the British Cabinet took the threat of the I.R.A. in Great Britain seriously. They considered it part of a wider United Kingdom-wide threat to the security of Great Britain, and they furthermore saw people like Michael Collins and Richard Mulcahy as the architects of this campaign against the British state. Indeed, in terms of concluding today's lecture, we should give the final word to David Lloyd George, the Prime Minister, who, in an apocryphal exchange with Michael Collins at Downing Street on the opening day of the Anglo-Irish Treaty negotiations, reportedly said, quote, "The destructive work of your London unit caused my government greater concern than that of your whole organisation in Ireland," unquote. So thank you very much for taking the time to listen to this lecture. As I've shown in this presentation, if you have any questions, I'd be more than willing to answer them. And thanks again to Jonathan Smith, to Cavan County Library, and to Cavan County Council's Decade of Centenaries programme, which has been generously supported by the Department of Culture, Heritage and the Gaeltacht, for allowing me the opportunity to present this lecture to you this evening. Thank you.